After my older sister Clara was responsible for my death, my ex-boyfriend Mark married her. They even had a daughter together and named her after me, Emily. I watched them bring my parents, Susan and David, to my grave, asking for my forgiveness for what Clara had done. Seeing them there, asking forgiveness for Clara's actions, felt deeply ironic. I wondered who they were really trying to convince. Then, everything shifted, and I found myself reborn. I came back to awareness during the New Year's Eve dinner shared between the Miller and Davis families. I looked down at the half-full glass of orange juice in my hand, lost in a daze, until a familiar voice brought me back to the present moment. "It's New Year's Eve, Emily. Don't look so down," my mother, Susan, said, her tone laced with disapproval. "Look at all this wonderful food. Do you really need to argue with your sister over a piece of seafood?" I looked up and saw her displeased expression clearly. Memories from my past life came rushing back. "Everyone gets one piece," I replied quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. I was just trying to eat my own portion. How is that taking something from her? I glanced down at my plate just in time to see Mark quickly move the piece of abalone that had been mine onto Clara's plate. This was how it always was. Because Clara had been born with a heart condition, I was expected to give up everything for her. Anything she wanted, whether it was a toy, a treat, or an opportunity, had to be hers first. If she decided she didn't want something, only then might I be allowed near it. Every single time this happened, Clara would look at me with wide, seemingly innocent eyes and offer a soft apology, appearing delicate and blameless. Over time, I had learned that protesting was futile. Experience had taught me that it was easier to stay quiet and give in. I looked around the table. My mother and father both wore expressions of disapproval directed at me. Mark looked like he wanted to speak but remained silent. My father, David, frowned, his gaze filled with reproach. Everyone seemed to adore Clara, the sister who was always so understanding and frail. At this point in time, Mark and I had already broken up. He had finally admitted his feelings for Clara, though she hadn't officially accepted him yet, claiming she was considering my feelings. I hadn't wanted to attend this dinner at all, but my parents had insisted I needed to be more sensible and mature, so I had reluctantly agreed to come. "Emily must have eaten it already," Clara said softly, trying to push the plate with the abalone back towards me. But Mrs. Davis, Mark's mother, stopped her with a calm expression. "Emily," Mrs. Davis said, addressing me directly, "Mark is hosting us today. It's his decision who gets what, isn't it?" Every year, the Miller and Davis families held a joint New Year's Eve dinner, taking turns hosting. Clara's gentle smile faded, replaced by an awkward look. Mrs. Davis patted her hand comfortingly. My mother, looking impatient, cut in. "Enough, Emily. If you really want abalone that badly, go order another serving and pay for it yourself." My father tugged gently at her sleeve. All right, all right. She understands she was wrong." He then turned to me. "Emily, you're an adult now. You should try to be more understanding." Mr. Davis tried to smooth things over, placing a serving of mushrooms and greens onto my plate. "It's New Year's Eve. Let's all just enjoy the meal. Try these mushrooms. They're quite good." I managed a small smile and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Davis." I didn't particularly like mushrooms or greens, and neither did Clara. My parents, however, loved them. My own preferences rarely seemed to matter to them. In the past, anything Clara didn't eat, I was expected to finish. Only after an incident where I became physically ill at the table did they finally stop forcing me to eat things I disliked. Mrs. Davis, perhaps trying to seem fair, gave me another small helping of vegetables. "Emily, maybe I was a bit direct earlier. Please don't hold it against me. But I do feel I should mention, you're a grown woman now. You can't afford to be so willful." I smiled and nodded again, subtly checking the time on my watch. I calculated that I had about an hour and a half left of this dinner. In my previous life, I had stayed through the entire miserable meal, only to discover at the end that everyone claimed their phones weren't working, leaving me to pay the substantial bill. I wouldn't make that mistake again. I endured the rest of the meal until a server knocked on the door of the private room. I used it as my chance to escape, saying I needed to use the restroom. No one seemed suspicious, though Clara looked at me with a show of concern. I smiled faintly, said I'd only be a moment, and left the room. I had only brought my phone with me, making my departure easy. I walked directly to the restaurant's entrance, where the car I had pre-booked using an app was already waiting. Once I was safely inside the car, I blocked the contact numbers of everyone from the dinner. Let Mrs. Davis's precious son, Mark, handle the bill this time. After all, he was the host. When I arrived near my parents' neighborhood, I asked the driver to wait for a few minutes. I went inside their house and straight to the study. I searched through the desk drawers until I found the official household registration book. With that secured, I returned to the waiting car and directed the driver to my own apartment. I felt a small sense of relief that I had possessed some foresight in my previous life. After my parents had converted my childhood bedroom into a study for Clara, I had rented my own small apartment. I still remembered the cold, shaky feeling I'd experienced when I found all my belongings crammed into a tiny storage room. I had argued with them numerous times, but I always lost. To them, my happiness or comfort was always secondary if sacrificing it made Clara happy. Back in my apartment, I opened a real estate website on my phone and sent a message regarding a house I remembered from my past life. I had found it much earlier this time around. I hoped I wouldn't lose the opportunity to buy it now. On the day scheduled for viewing the house, I arrived on time to meet the owner and the real estate agent. The agent was already there and informed me that the owner was running slightly late. The agent seemed eager to make the sale and enthusiastically pointed out the house's advantages. I wanted to make a decision quickly too, but I tried to appear indifferent to have a better position for negotiating the price. "Sorry for the delay. Are you Miss Emily Miller?" A pleasant and somewhat familiar voice asked from behind me. I adjusted my expression into a polite smile and turned around, only to have the smile freeze on my face. The owner of the house looked remarkably like my current boss, Robert Carter. To make matters worse, I had called in sick to work that day. The agent noticed that Robert and I seemed to know each other and became even more enthusiastic, likely hoping this connection would help finalize the deal quickly. I managed an awkward greeting, thinking that I might sign the contract today, only to find myself unemployed tomorrow. However, after viewing the house, I felt it was perfectly suited for my needs, so I expressed my strong interest in buying it, despite the unease caused by Robert's friendly smile. To my surprise, Robert offered a 10% discount on the originally listed price. It was an unexpected and welcome development, and I immediately signed the purchase contract, pushing aside my nervousness about the work situation. After the agent left, feeling the need to explain myself, I quickly apologized to Robert. "Sorry, boss, I didn't intend to skip work today. It's just that your house is exactly what I was looking for, and the price was right. I was worried someone else might buy it if I waited." Robert smiled gently. "No worries, Emily. I skipped work today, too." I couldn't help but think that, as the head of the company, his definition of skipping work was likely quite different from mine. "Oh, by the way, Miss Miller," he continued, it's lunchtime. Would you like to grab something to eat together?" Honestly, the thought of spending off-hours time with my boss wasn't appealing, but declining felt impolite, especially after he had given me a discount. I forced a smile and agreed. "Sure, boss. Please, just call me Emily." All right, Emily. And you can call me Robert when we're not at the office," he suggested. I hesitated for a moment. Robert smiled again. Hearing boss all the time makes me feel like I'm working around the clock. It's not particularly relaxing. I reluctantly agreed to his request. I had initially thought that since Robert gave me such a significant discount, I should treat him to lunch. However, when he led me to a rather upscale restaurant known for its excellent reviews, I quietly decided against reaching for my wallet. Over lunch, my curiosity got the better of me. "Why did you offer the 10% discount?" I asked, still finding it difficult to call him by his first name. "Because you were straightforward," Robert replied as he poured me some tea. "I don't often handle real estate deals myself. I did once before, and it left a rather unpleasant impression. It seemed he owned more properties than I had realized." Feeling more at ease now, Robert smiled, placing a portion of the restaurant's signature dish onto my plate. After the meal, Robert offered to give me a ride, but I was about to politely decline when I heard familiar voices near the restaurant entrance. "Emily! Emily!" Hearing those voices made me frown internally. I knew I couldn't avoid them forever, but encountering Mark and Clara so soon was frustrating. Clara walked quickly towards me and took my hand. Emily, do you know how worried we were about you? You blocked all of us and we couldn't reach you at all. Clara glanced briefly at Robert beside me. Even if the elders said something you didn't like that day, you shouldn't have just left without saying anything. Was it really necessary to make such a scene just because you didn't get one dish? You weren't like this before. A few restaurant staff members nearby glanced in our direction. Mark quickly lowered his voice. As a well-known pianist with a considerable following, he usually tried to maintain a low profile in public to avoid being recognized, often choosing quieter dining spots. He whispered to me, "Follow us to a private room." I felt a pang of sadness reflecting on how much I used to cater to his whims, thinking he could summon me whenever he pleased. I ignored him and turned to Robert. "Boss, shall we go?" Robert nodded, paused for a moment, and then started walking with me. Unexpectedly, Mark and Clara decided to abandon their own lunch plans and followed us out of the restaurant and towards a nearby underground parking lot where fewer people were around. Once there, Mark became bolder and grabbed my arm. I frowned and spoke loudly, "Oh, what do you want?" Mark remained silent. "I want to take you to see your parents," Clara interjected, stepping in front of Robert as he moved to intervene. "You must be Emily's boss? Please, this is a personal matter between us and her. If it's between you and her, then she should have a say in whether I can be involved," Robert stated calmly, moving past Clara to stand closer to me. Mark still held onto my arm tightly. I warned him sternly, "Mark, aren't you a pianist? If you don't want to be able to play anymore, I can certainly help with that." I raised my phone, aiming the camera towards his hand, gripping my arm. Mark's greatest fear was injuring his hands. His expression turned anxious, and he reluctantly released me, looking at me with disbelief. He seemed genuinely shocked, especially since during our relationship, I had always been more concerned about his hands than he was himself. Even a tiny scratch would make me nervous. Now, I realized how foolish that had been. Wanting to leave quickly, I turned to Robert. "Could you possibly give me a ride home, mister? Robert?" Robert chuckled softly. "I'm only in my early 30s, Emily, not that old. Follow me." Feeling slightly embarrassed, I quickly walked beside him. Clara grabbed my arm again. "Emily, please don't be like this. Do you have any idea what happened after you left the dinner that day?" "You didn't pay the bill, right?" I asked flatly. Clara continued. "There was an incident. Mark and I couldn't use our phones for some reason, and our parents don't know how to use mobile payments." I laughed lightly. "That sounds like your problem, not mine. I barely ate anything that day. Shouldn't you be the one settling the bill?" Clara mumbled, My phone battery died, Emily." Robert had already opened the door of a Bentley. "Get in, all right?" "Okay," I responded cheerfully, opening the passenger door and getting inside. Robert started the car and maneuvered towards the parking lot exit. In the rearview mirror, I saw Mark and Clara trying to follow on foot, but then Clara suddenly clutched her chest and bent over with Mark quickly supporting her. Was she having a heart attack? I wasn't sure. I doubted that brief encounter could genuinely affect her condition so severely. Robert dropped me off at the entrance to my apartment complex. "Thanks for the ride, and sorry for all the trouble today," I said. "Don't worry about it," he replied. "Everyone deals with complicated situations sometimes." I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle. "Hold on a second, Emily," Robert said. I paused, a little surprised. "Actually, I was hoping to ask for your help with something. I was planning to call you about it tonight, but then it turned out you were the buyer for the house. Quite a coincidence." I had a feeling the discount on the house wouldn't come without some kind of catch. Since I had benefited from his generosity, I felt obligated to at least hear what he had to say. It turned out he needed me to work overtime on a project. I wasn't thrilled about it, but considering I had skipped work earlier, he had been understanding about the house situation, and he was offering good compensation for the extra hours. I agreed. He also mentioned that his previous assistant had recently resigned, and he was considering offering me the position. That news made me feel much better. Focusing on my career seemed like the most sensible path forward right now. Love hadn't worked out well for me. Perhaps focusing on professional success was the way to go. After the house transfer was finalized, I planned to take some time off to officially move my household registration. Robert immediately approved half a day off for me and simply told me to be careful. Having such a considerate boss made me feel genuinely appreciative. As I was nearing the police station to handle the registration paperwork, I received a call from an unknown number. I hadn't been bothered by Mark or Clara since our encounter at the restaurant, which had made me lower my guard slightly. So, when I heard my father's voice on the phone, I was startled. He calmly invited me to have a family dinner on Saturday night, saying that families shouldn't hold grudges over small things. I immediately realized they likely wanted something from me, probably to make me take responsibility for something again. In my previous life, a similar situation had occurred. My father had lent his car to an old friend who needed to run an errand. I knew this friend was unreliable and had advised my dad against lending the car, but my father felt he couldn't refuse an old acquaintance. My mother scolded me for interfering in adult matters, and Clara added that parents usually know best. Mom praised Clara for her sensibility. Not long after, the friend got into an accident while driving drunk and then fled the scene. Legally, my father wasn't liable for the accident itself, but the friend's driver's license had expired and he had no means to pay the compensation owed to the victim. This left my father responsible for paying tens of thousands of dollars. My parents were reasonably well off financially. They had around $100,000 in savings, held some company shares, and owned property. However, they were planning to buy a house for Clara's future wedding and had already found one they liked. Paying the compensation would mean delaying the house purchase. Consequently, they turned their attention to my savings. Over the years, they had become adept at manipulating me using the concept of family obligation. We raised you all these years and now you refuse to help us in an emergency? What a thankless child. Or, Emily, this house is really a great deal. It would be a shame to miss out on it. I know I was wrong not to listen to your advice about the car, but won't you help your dad out just this once? I remembered looking into Clara's subtly smug eyes as she seemingly defended me, saying, "It's not like I absolutely need to buy a house right now. I might not even get married in the next couple of years, especially with my health." Did my parents even remember that I was only 2 years younger than Clara? "Don't overthink it, Clara," my mom had said. "Mark is a good young man. He won't mind waiting." Then Mom paused, perhaps realizing Mark was my ex-boyfriend. "Anyway, that's not your concern." She then turned back to me patiently. "We know you've always felt we favor your sister, Emily. But given her health, it's natural for us to worry about her more. We love both of you just the same." Yearning for that elusive feeling of equal family love, I ended up giving them years of my hard-earned savings, persuaded by my parents' words and Clara's performance. Recalling the past was difficult. I didn't want any more contact with them, but to make things clear once and for all, I agreed to have dinner with my dad. They chose the same restaurant where we had the disastrous New Year's Eve dinner. When I arrived, the three of them, my parents and Clara, were already seated and waiting. Seeing me, my mom immediately signaled the server and then joked, "This time we've ordered all the special dishes just for you, Emily. Eat as much as you like." She still seemed to believe I'd cut contact simply because of the abalone incident. Clara wore a peaceful expression, acting as if nothing unpleasant had ever happened between us. She asked about Robert, wondering aloud if he was my new boyfriend. My dad looked surprised. "You have a boyfriend, Emily?" "No," I replied slowly. "He's my boss. Didn't I refer to him that way in front of Clara the other day?" Clara smiled gently. "Well, your boss seems very nice to you. Taking you to that restaurant isn't cheap. It must be difficult on your salary." "Exactly," I nodded, playing along. "I've always struggled financially. In fact, I just bought a house recently, so my entire savings are gone." "What?" I took some satisfaction in seeing the shocked expressions on their faces. After the initial shock passed, my parents looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and blame. Clara didn't say much. She knew her role was often to appear understanding and let our parents handle the difficult conversations. She kept comforting them, suggesting that perhaps I had my reasons for buying a house. My mom said irritably, "Your sister is trying to speak up for you, and yet you remain so thoughtless." The food arrived, but I just took a sip of water. "You always said the family money was intended for Clara and that I needed to support myself," I stated calmly. So, I made my own decision regarding my finances. My dad looked disappointed. Why do you need to divide things so strictly within a family, Emily? I admit we may have favored your sister materially sometimes, but we love both of you equally. Perhaps parents who show partiality find comfort in telling themselves such things. If they repeat it often enough, maybe they even start to believe it. So, how much money do you have left now? My mom asked directly, realizing the emotional approach wasn't working. None, I replied calmly. Just a couple $1,000s for basic living expenses. I wasn't being entirely truthful. After the down payment on the house, I still had a few thousand saved for emergencies, but I wasn't about to tell them that. Mom struggled to contain her anger. A couple thousand? You should have saved more. What if you need money for something unexpected? We won't be able to help you. I smiled faintly. For what kind of situation, Mom? She fell silent. Clara glanced at our parents and then suggested, maybe Emily should know about Dad's situation. She's part of the family, too. Dad sighed heavily and began to explain what had happened. The same story as in my past life. His friend borrowed the car, caused an accident, and now couldn't afford the compensation. Dad sighed again. The victim's family threatened to cause trouble at the school where I teach, unless they receive the compensation soon. After finishing his explanation, he looked at me expectantly, his expression troubled. Why are you looking at me? I asked plainly. I don't have any money. I sighed along with them for effect. Dad still seemed to possess some pride and couldn't bring himself to ask me directly for money, so he hesitated. Clara, who had been eating quietly, decided it was her cue to play the role of the caring daughter. She turned to me and asked if I could help find a solution. I chuckled softly. Can't you just use the family savings for now? My mom immediately raised her eyebrows, ready to argue, but Dad signaled her to stop. Seeing this interaction, Clara started blaming herself. It's all my fault. Mom and Dad said they were saving to buy me a house for when I get married. But honestly, who knows if I'll ever get married? Maybe you shouldn't buy the house after all. Mom, feeling sorry for Clara, hugged her tightly. Don't say that, sweetheart. We absolutely have to buy that house for you. Where else could we find such a wonderful place at such a reasonable price? I shrugged. There's nothing I can do then. Emily, Clara lowered her voice, leaning slightly towards me. I know this is difficult, but could you perhaps try to borrow some money from your coworkers or friends? You know, with Mom and Dad's age and positions, it's difficult for them to ask around for money. College professors and company executives can't borrow money? I scoffed inwardly, but kept my expression neutral. The people I know are mostly at my same professional level, who can just lend out tens of thousands of dollars on short notice. All three of them fell silent. It wasn't because they had suddenly developed a conscience or become more understanding. They knew what I said was true. They couldn't guilt-trip that amount of money out of me through my own connections. But Clara wasn't ready to give up her act just yet. Emily, she suggested, could you maybe ask your boss for a loan? I answered bluntly, no. What did you say? Mom was visibly upset now. I gave a small, sarcastic smile internally, but kept my voice even. What am I supposed to do? Borrow a large sum from my boss? How would I pay it back? What about my mortgage payments? Who said you had to move out? Mom countered. You can rent out the new house, come back home, and live with us. Then you just work hard to pay back your boss. Why would I possibly want to leave a spacious house I own to move back into a tiny storage room? I stood up from the table. Maybe it's best if we stop communicating altogether from now on. The trio looked shocked again, probably not expecting the usually compliant me to actually refuse to tolerate their behavior any longer. Even Dad, who was generally somewhat kinder to me, looked differently at me after hearing my declaration. You want to cut ties with us? He asked, his voice hardening. Don't forget that the law requires you to support us financially when we're older. He softened his tone slightly. Why hold on to grudges between family members, Emily? Just apologize to your mother and you'll still be our good daughter. I waved my hand dismissively and started walking towards the door. You already have a good daughter in Clara. As for supporting you financially, I'll follow the law. Once you reach the legal age for support, you can take me to court. Whatever the court decides I owe, I'll pay. Emily, what about the bill? Mom called out. With a small smile, I pointed back at the table. I haven't touched a single bite of food on this table. You wouldn't expect me to pay, would you? Get out, Mom shouted. From now on, we'll pretend we never had a daughter like you. Sounds good to me, I replied quietly as I walked out. I thought Mom might actually stick to her word this time, but less than 2 hours later, I received a text message from her using a new phone number. Clara said she'll borrow the money from Mark. If you ever want to be considered part of this family again, you'll have to repay that debt. Oops, I had forgotten to block that new number immediately. I didn't reply right away. After a few moments, I unblocked Mom's original number and sent a message. I have some questions about this loan. Mom replied coldly with 2 words. What questions? Seeing her reply, I immediately started a screen recording and enabled audio recording on my phone. Then I texted back, Mom, if Dad's friend borrowed the car and caused the accident, shouldn't the friend be responsible for the payment? Or Dad himself? Why should I be responsible for repaying a loan taken out for that? Mom quickly responded, What do you mean by that? Whether you like it or not, you are responsible for this money. She then sent a voice message. Don't even think about contacting Mark directly to repay him. You will repay the money through your father and me. You and Mark are finished. He likes your sister now. Be mature and don't cause any trouble for them. After that, she sent a series of messages scolding me for being less considerate than Clara. I listened to them, saved the recordings, and then blocked her number again. Later that evening, I turned on the television and happened to catch an interview with Mark. The reporter asked him, You have a large fan base curious about your personal life. Can you tell us what type of person you're attracted to? Mark smiled for the camera. Actually, there's one girl I've had feelings for many years. After my current tour concludes, I'm planning to confess my feelings to her. With Mark's substantial following, this statement generated considerable buzz online. The reporter looked surprised. So, you've never had a girlfriend before? Mark paused briefly before answering. No. So, the time we spent together apparently meant nothing to him now. Surprisingly, I felt calm hearing this. Everything Mark said didn't hurt the way it might have before. Our breakup felt like something that had happened a long time ago. The reporter smiled. Well, I wish you the best of luck with your tour and your confession. I silently wished Clara and Mark a long future together, hoping they would leave me alone. Mark's confession caused an explosion online. Hashtags like #MarkConfesses, #MarksCrush, and #MarksChildhoodSweetheart trended for days. I closed the browser, wanting to avoid the online gossip, and decided to watch a movie instead. The online buzz continued until it gradually died down by Monday. After work that day, I saw Clara waiting near the entrance of my office building, looking somewhat downcast. Emily, can we talk for just a moment? If you don't feel up to it, just say no. Robert's voice came from behind me. He walked up, looking at Clara and then at me with concern. Need any help? I'm okay, I can handle this, I replied. Clara wasn't someone who intimidated me. Robert nodded. All right, call me if you need anything or call security. I managed a small chuckle. Got it, thanks. Using his first name still felt a bit awkward, but being overly formal seemed unfriendly after our recent interactions. I mumbled something noncommittal. Clara scoffed quietly. Mr. Carter, you're exaggerating. I'm Emily's sister. I wouldn't harm her. Robert ignored her and walked straight to his car. Clara shifted nervously and said to me, Emily, can we discuss this somewhere quieter? To avoid creating a scene in front of my workplace, I agreed and walked with her to a cafe across the street. Once we were seated, Clara spoke urgently. Emily, I had no idea Mark was going to say those things on TV. I discreetly started the recording app on my phone under the table. Clara added, Emily, if you don't want me to be with him, I won't accept him. Here we go again, I thought. Did anyone else know you were coming to see me today? I asked. No, I came straight here after work. I haven't told anyone yet, she replied. All right then, I'll be direct, I said calmly. Honestly, I don't care about your situation with Mark. Whether the two of you end up together or not is none of my business. I stood up to leave, but Clara grabbed my hand again. I felt a flicker of unease, worried she might suddenly pretend to feel faint or have a health episode, leaving me unable to explain the situation. It was an old tactic, but often effective. Emily, I'm going to turn Mark down, Clara insisted. Please don't distance yourself from us, okay? Mom and Dad really miss you. Clara! I looked up and saw my mother, Susan, approaching our table quickly. Nowadays, I preferred thinking of her as Ms. Miller. Miss Miller rushed over to Clara's side, glaring daggers at me. Emily! Are you ignoring me now? I told you not to bother Clara. Conveniently, at that exact moment, Clara seemed unable to form a complete sentence and started gasping for breath. Mom, it's not Emily, it's me. I felt speechless at the predictability of it all. I explained calmly, it was your daughter who asked me to meet her, and now she's the one holding onto my hand. Your sister is clearly unwell, and you're still arguing? Ms. Miller was furious and raised her hand to slap me. Since Clara was still holding one of my hands, I couldn't easily dodge. I turned my head instinctively, and in the brief moment of chaos, my free hand pushed Ms. Miller slightly off balance. Her hand missed my face and ended up slapping Clara instead. Clara's head jerked to the side, and she naturally let go of my hand in surprise. I seized the opportunity to break free. Ignoring Ms. Miller's shouts, I ran out of the cafe. Just as I reached the street and was about to hail a cab, the same Bentley from before pulled up right in front of me. Get in! Robert leaned out from the driver's window, offering a small smile. I felt awkward getting into my boss's car again under these circumstances, but seeing Ms. Miller and Clara emerging from the cafe and heading towards me, I quickly opened the passenger door and got in without further thought. After Robert started the car and we had driven a short distance, I started to wonder, had it really taken him that long just to get his car from the parking lot? Or had he been waiting nearby, perhaps anticipating trouble? Soon, we arrived back at the entrance of my new apartment complex. I had moved in a few days prior, as Robert had sold the place fully furnished, making the move relatively simple. See you tomorrow, Assistant Manager Emily, Robert said as I prepared to get out. I nodded, then paused as his words registered. He had called me Assistant Manager Emily. It must mean I had received the promotion he mentioned earlier. He noticed my reaction and smiled slightly. Seems like you're getting accustomed to the new title already. I felt a little shy for a moment, then joked, Boss, a promotion usually comes with a raise, right? Or I could double it, he replied easily. I liked the sound of that. We chatted for a few more moments. Robert seemed genuinely interested in establishing a friendship beyond our professional relationship, but I still felt hesitant. Why would he want to be friends with me? Perhaps I've been too forward, making you uncomfortable, Robert said, his tone becoming more serious. I apologize if that's the case, and I hope you don't mind. Since he was being so open about it, I felt I had to address my own reservations honestly. I didn't want any awkwardness to affect my work. Boss, I appreciate the gesture, truly, but until I understand your reasons better, I feel it's probably best if I continue to call you boss, at least for now. I meant it sincerely. Robert asked calmly, You wonder why I want to be friends with you? Boss, I began, choosing my words carefully. You don't seem like someone who lacks friends, and I definitely don't flatter myself into thinking you have some romantic interest in me. Without understanding the reason, I'd always feel a bit uneasy. After all, I added, gesturing vaguely, you're the founder of a company that's growing rapidly, soon to have its own major office building. Friendship usually requires some common ground, doesn't it? Silence fell between us for a moment. Then Robert sighed lightly. About half a year ago, I happened to be passing by the Garden Complex apartments. I saw you having an argument with your mother and sister. I instantly knew which incident he was referring to. It was right after my breakup with Mark. Growing up feeling neglected and craving affection, I had fallen hard for Mark when he initially pursued me. I had been genuinely happy then, even managing to brush off my parents' constant favoritism towards Clara. Then, Mark suddenly announced he realized he was actually in love with Clara, saying he had only ever seen me as a sister and couldn't continue lying about his feelings. I couldn't recall my exact emotions that day, just an overwhelming sense of anger and betrayal. I had wanted to confront Clara, even hit her. Clara claimed she had no idea about Mark's feelings, and my parents immediately defended her. Mom even scolded me, calling Clara and Mark a perfect match, while I was positioned as the one causing problems, essentially the third wheel. Unable to bear it, I had run out of the house with Clara chasing after me, crying and promising she would never get together with Mark. Perhaps I was too shaken up at the time. My mother, acting unusually kind, spoke a few soothing words, blaming Mark for the situation and asking me not to hold it against Clara. I had foolishly bought into Clara's apparent innocence and Mom's momentary softened stance, swallowing my pain. I never expected Clara to continue her habit of taking things that were mine, nor for Mom to later become so supportive of Mark and Clara's relationship, despite blaming Mark initially. "Did you decide you wanted to be friends with me just because of what you saw that day?" I asked, still puzzled. "I have a distant cousin," Robert explained. "Her family heavily favored her brother, completely neglecting her needs. She couldn't even secure a student loan for college, despite her family having sufficient means, while working multiple jobs to pay for her own education and also helping cover her sister's tuition. She overworked herself to exhaustion. Then, well, there was an accident." "It was an accident?" I murmured, feeling a sense of empathy. "She was fiercely independent and didn't want to ask anyone for help, feeling our families weren't close enough for her to impose," Robert said, a touch of sadness in his voice. Was he projecting his feelings about his cousin onto my situation? Feeling awkward, I said, "Well, I'm grown up now and have a job. I can take care of myself." "I know," Robert replied. "Usually, I wouldn't interfere in someone's personal matters like this. But on the day we viewed the house, I thought calling you by your first name might help you relax, since you seemed quite nervous. It seems it only made you more anxious." He paused. Then, after lunch, "Seeing your sister and that must have been your ex-boyfriend, right? Observing how you interacted with them, combined with you taking time off work to finalize the house purchase so quickly, I figured things with your family probably hadn't smoothed over. So, I offered help those 2 times. But it seems my attempts might have just added more stress for you." And thinking about it, Robert hadn't actually interfered directly in my personal life beyond offering assistance when I was clearly in a difficult situation. Maybe he had helped simply out of kindness. Perhaps I had been overthinking his motives. I felt even more awkward now. "But you mentioned common ground earlier?" I asked, curious about what he meant. "Like," Robert began, a slight smile returning, "I think your sister is not quite the innocent flower she appears to be. More like someone very skilled at manipulating situations to her advantage. You must feel the same way, right?" "Ha ha!" I couldn't help but let out a small laugh. "What if I'm actually the one in the wrong here?" Robert said calmly, "I'd still trust my instincts." He looked at me directly. "If you're not comfortable yet, you can continue to address me however you like. And if you need help with anything, personal or professional, please feel free to come to me. I just want my team members to be able to focus on their work without being unduly bothered by personal issues." I could sense his sincerity this time. "Thanks, boss," I replied. "I appreciate that." "Great," he said. "By the way, are you free on Sunday?" "Huh?" I thought, another Sunday work session? "No plans yet," I answered hesitantly. But he had been nice, so why not? Robert explained his plan, and I was a bit surprised. "It would be really helpful, Emily," he added. "No problem," I agreed, though I don't have much experience with that sort of thing. "That's okay," he reassured me. "She's generally pretty easygoing." This was certainly a unique work-related request, so I started preparing for it after I got home. During a break from my preparations, I saw a text message from Mark sent from yet another new number. He told me I should apologize to Clara and that I didn't need to worry about repaying the money they borrowed, presumably for my dad's friend's accident. I found their pettiness almost amusing, constantly using new numbers just to contact me, likely because I kept blocking them. Since I couldn't whitelist numbers due to work calls, I decided to mute notifications from unknown numbers instead. Then, I sent the audio recording from the cafe encounter to Mark's social media account, reminding him that I wasn't responsible for their debt and telling him to stop bothering me. The next thing I knew, I had been added to a group chat titled Family. A stranger in the group tagged me saying, "Emily, your mother has told me everything." Filial piety is the most important virtue. How could you treat your parents this way? Listen to your uncle and apologize to them, uncle. So, the relatives from my past life, the ones indirectly involved in my leg injury, were showing up again. Ha! Last time, this same uncle, George, and his family had visited my parents and lectured me endlessly. His son, Leo, was consistently rude to me but always obedient and sweet towards Clara. Whenever Leo came over, he would cling to Clara, wanting her to play with him. However, one weekend, Mark invited Clara out. Uncle George and my mother, Susan, insisted that I should babysit Leo instead. Leo, however, strongly resisted the idea and started hitting me. Uncle George only gave him a half-hearted scolding before turning the blame on me, questioning why his son disliked me so much but adored my sister. Clara wasn't particularly thrilled about dragging along two extra people, me and Leo, on her outing with Mark, but she didn't refuse. Once we reached a shopping mall, things went wrong. Leo was overly energetic and ran around bumping into a store clerk who was setting up a promotional display. Mark tried to grab Leo to stop him, but lost his balance near the top of an escalator, nearly falling down. Driven by the lingering feelings I had for Mark back then, I instinctively rushed forward to push both Mark and Leo back to safety. In doing so, I lost my own balance and tumbled down the escalator. A heavy promotional sign that the clerk had been working on fell down after me, crushing my leg. I ended up with a severe fracture. Although it eventually healed to some extent, I was never able to engage in more than mild physical exercise afterward. Feeling guilty, Mark suggested we get back together, promising to take responsibility for me. Overjoyed at the prospect of reconciliation, I agreed. Seeing this, my mother urged me to break up with him, claiming my leg was perfectly fine as long as I walked slowly and that trying to hold Mark responsible felt forced and manipulative. To solidify his commitment and perhaps cut off any lingering feelings for Clara, Mark proposed soon after I was discharged from the hospital. He invited both families to an engagement party. On the day of the party, Clara didn't show up initially, claiming she was feeling unwell. But just as Mark was about to place the engagement ring on my finger, she appeared outside the venue window, soaking wet from the rain. Mark's hand trembled as he held the ring. After Clara gave him a sad, lingering smile and turned to leave, he mumbled, "Sorry" to me and ran after her. Mark's parents, the Davises, actually encouraged him to go after Clara. My mother, Susan, quickly held me back, but she needn't have bothered. With my injured leg, I wouldn't have been able to catch up anyway. After that fiasco, my father, David, gave a long speech about moving on and family unity, but I barely remember the details now. From that day forward, any remaining positive feelings I had towards my family vanished completely. I saw that my mother had tagged me in the new family group chat. Mark and Clara are going out on Sunday. You can babysit Leo. Remember to be nice to him. I ignored the message and muted the group chat notifications. Oddly, Clara also sent me a private message, asking me to join them on Sunday so we could mend our relationship. Her sudden urgency seemed to push my mother into pestering me even more persistently via calls and texts, which I later saw in my blocked call log. I guess they simply wanted free childcare. I definitely wasn't going to agree. However, I was puzzled by Clara's tactic. Was she trying to provoke me by flaunting her relationship with Mark? It seemed too obvious and clumsy, not her usual subtle style. Who knew what her real motive was, but it wasn't my problem anymore. In this new life, I wasn't present at the mall during that incident. I wondered if Mark managed to stay safe this time, as he had in the past life when I intervened. But this coming Sunday, I did have plans. I had agreed to take Sophie out. Sophie was Robert's younger sister. After Robert's distant cousin passed away, his mother, Helen Carter, couldn't bear the situation of the remaining family. She gave the surviving parents some money and formally adopted their second daughter, Sophie, bringing her into their family. Sophie now shared the Carter family name. Just earlier in the car, Robert had explained that Sophie had recently done well on her school exams. He had promised to take her out for a fun day as a reward, but had been too busy with work, so it kept getting postponed. He admitted he didn't have much experience entertaining children and asked for my help. Since Robert had helped me significantly with the house purchase and the promotion, I felt it was only fair to return the favor. Besides, Robert mentioned that Sophie was a well-behaved and pleasant child, which sounded much better than dealing with Leo, who was known for being difficult. On Sunday, I arrived at the amusement park 15 minutes early and saw Robert already waiting with a young girl. I quickly walked over and apologized. "Sorry, boss, have you been waiting long?" "No, we just got here," Robert replied warmly. The little girl beside him seemed a bit shy, but took the initiative to greet me politely. "Hello, Sister Emily." "Hi, Sophie." I responded with a smile and handed her a small gift I had bought in advance, a nice pen set. "This is for you." Sophie didn't take it right away. She looked up at Robert and only accepted it after he nodded his approval. "Thank you, Sister Emily," she said quietly, taking the pen set. We walked into the amusement park together. Robert leaned closer and whispered, "Emily, there was no need for you to spend your own money. I'll reimburse you." I waved his comment off. "It's nothing, boss, just a small welcome gift." Robert just smiled. After spending the morning enjoying the rides and attractions at the park, we were all starting to feel a bit tired. Robert suggested taking Sophie for lunch, and I was fortunate enough to be included in the invitation, a free work-related meal. Surprisingly, Robert drove towards the Atlantis Tower building, the same place where the escalator incident with Mark had happened in my past life. Robert and Sophie were genuinely nice people. If I suddenly claimed to feel unwell, they would likely insist on taking me to a hospital, which would ruin the lunch plan. So I decided to just go along with it, hoping fervently that we wouldn't run into Mark, Clara, or their entourage. But of course, what I feared came to pass. Robert went to park the car, telling me to take Sophie ahead to the restaurant located on the top floor. As Sophie and I reached the electronics floor via the escalator, I heard a loud, annoyed voice. "Are you still following us? You're so annoying. Don't hang around us, what a pain." I looked over and saw a boy around 13 or 14 years old, arms crossed, looking thoroughly irritated. It was Leo, Emily, Clara, and Mark came up the escalator behind him. "Clara, can we please get rid of this tag-along?" Leo whined, gesturing towards me. "Leo, you shouldn't say that," Clara said softly. "Emily is still your cousin." She then bent down slightly to Leo. "Promise me you'll treat Emily with respect, okay?" I looked at the three of them, Clara, Mark, and Leo, and thought about the potential danger associated with this location based on my past life. I leaned down and whispered to Sophie, "Let's try to stay away from those three people." Sophie looked at them, then nodded obediently. Clara noticed Sophie beside me and asked with a forced smile, "Emily, who is this child with you?" "It's none of your business," I replied coolly. Clara's smile stiffened. I was just trying to say hello. Mark was wearing sunglasses, so I couldn't read his expression, but I could imagine he probably looked displeased. Not that I cared anymore. "Does Miss Miller always greet strangers with such inquiries?" Robert arrived, stepping off the escalator behind us. I didn't know when Leo might cause another commotion, or if that troublesome store clerk from the past was nearby. Once Robert was beside me, I whispered, "Let's just ignore them and go." Sophie tugged on Robert's sleeve. "Brother, I'm hungry." Robert patted her head gently and smiled. "All right, let's go eat then." I breathed a sigh of relief and started walking towards the next escalator with them. Leo incredulously yelled after me, "Tag along? Where do you think you're going?" Robert shot him a cold look that immediately silenced him. As we were heading towards the next set of escalators, I heard a young girl crying nearby. A family was arguing at an electronic dictionary counter. The girl wanted a specific brand, but the salesman was aggressively pushing her parents to buy a much more expensive model, claiming it had superior pronunciation features. Her parents seemed unsure but were being swayed by his persuasive tactics. I sighed inwardly. Despite the salesman's pushiness, it was clear the parents loved their daughter enough to consider splurging on the expensive item, unlike my own biological parents, whose actions weren't worth dwelling on. And that salesman? He looked exactly like the person who had caused the trouble in my past life. As I walked past, the girl finally seemed to give in, letting her parents choose the model the salesman recommended. The salesman beamed, pleased at having convinced another customer. Just then, His phone rang. A look of panic washed over his face as he answered it, and he immediately rushed off in the direction we had just come from. Only seconds later, I heard a commotion from the area he had run towards, followed by Clara's distinct scream, "Mark!" Then came the sound of a crash, and a man's voice screamed out in pain, "Ah, my hand!" By then, Sophie, Robert, and I were already ascending on the next escalator, unable to see exactly what was happening below. Murmurs rippled through the crowd around us. Someone fell off the escalator. 2 people fell. I recognize that guy. He's a pianist I've seen on TV. His hand got crushed by that advertising board. So Mark's hand got injured this time instead of my leg? The salesman apparently fared much worse, reportedly being injured by a falling structural element during the chaos. That sounded truly gruesome. "Emily, come help! Mark fell!" Clara ran towards the bottom of our escalator, shouting frantically up at me. A bystander near me tugged my sleeve. "Are they calling you?" "They must have the wrong person," Robert answered calmly before I could respond. The bystander shrugged and let it go. As the escalator carried us further upwards, leaving Clara behind, Robert noticed my slight frown. "Are you worried about them?" I shook my head. "No, just thinking about it makes me lose my appetite." I glanced at Sophie, suddenly wondering if discussing such events was inappropriate in front of a child. "Wait." Robert seemed to guess my thoughts and spoke to Sophie gently. "Those people weren't very nice to Sister Emily earlier." Sophie then looked at me and said seriously, "Sister Emily shouldn't be nice to them either." What a sweet and perceptive child. We arrived at the rooftop restaurant. Thanks to Robert, I enjoyed a rather fancy lunch. After the meal, the plan was to take Sophie to see a movie she was very excited about. She chattered happily about it during lunch. Thinking about her past and how she ended up with the Carter family, I sighed inwardly. It was fortunate she had met genuinely good people like Robert and his mother. "My mother adopted Sophie not just out of pity," Robert said softly, perhaps noticing my expression. "It's probably because she shared similar experiences growing up." "Huh? What do you mean?" I asked, surprised. Robert smiled lightly. "My mother also has a brother." "Oh, I see," I murmured, beginning to understand a little more. As soon as we stepped out of the Atlantis Tower building after lunch, Robert received a phone call. His expression changed as he listened. After hanging up, he turned to me, looking concerned. "Sorry, Emily, something urgent has come up at the company that I need to handle immediately, and I'm going to need you to take care of a personal matter for me." Although I felt my job as assistant manager was primarily to handle company-related tasks, perhaps this was something significant or sensitive. "All right, boss, what do you need me to do?" I asked. "My mother was admitted to the hospital this morning," he explained. "I need you to go check on her for me." I nodded without asking further questions. He gave me the hospital address and room number. I was surprised to realize it was the same hospital where Clara often went for her checkups and treatments. Robert initially wanted me to take Sophie home first, but Sophie insisted on going to the hospital as soon as she heard her adoptive mother wasn't well. Robert thought it over for a moment and then asked me to take care of Sophie during the visit. I bought some lilies and apples from a nearby shop, hailed a car, and headed straight to the hospital with Sophie. There, near the entrance of the main building, I ran into my father, David, and Mark's father, Mr. Davis. My father's face fell the moment he saw me. "What are you doing here?" he asked curtly. Mr. Davis also looked unwelcoming but didn't say anything. It seemed Mark had indeed been brought here for treatment after the incident. Not wanting to engage with them, I planned to walk past and find the correct building mentioned in the address Robert gave me. But my father spoke again, his voice low and strained. "Your sister became so stressed because of your behavior that she ended up in the hospital. Don't go disturbing her now. Go home and think about what you've done." So, Clara was in the hospital too? Considering what Robert had mentioned earlier about his mother potentially having heart-related issues, could Helen Carter possibly be in the same wing or even the same area as Clara? Sophie tugged at my sleeve and pointed towards a different building across the courtyard. "We're supposed to go to building 2, right, Sister Emily?" I felt relieved that we didn't have to go into the main building where Clara likely was, especially since my mother, Susan, might also be there, ready with harsh words. I turned to leave with Sophie, but my father shouted, Where do you think you're going? I reluctantly stopped and turned back. I'm here to visit someone else, not Clara or Mark. You. My father's face turned red with anger. At that moment, a doctor approached to explain Clara's condition to my father, and Mr. Davis answered a call, likely from his wife, discussing Mark's situation or emotional state. Taking advantage of the temporary distraction, I quickly walked away with Sophie. On the way to Building 2, Sophie asked quietly, "Who were those two men, Sister Emily? They seemed so mean." I replied softly, "The one who yelled is my biological father. The other one with the sour expression is my ex-boyfriend's dad, the father of the man with sunglasses you saw earlier at the mall." I worried I might have made the explanation too complicated, but Sophie just nodded thoughtfully and said, "I think your ex-boyfriend isn't as nice as my big brother Robert." I was surprised by her observation. Sophie looked 2 or 3 years younger than Leo, but seemed much more aware. Trying to clarify things quickly, I said, "Your brother and I just have a professional relationship, Sophie." "But Sister Emily, you still go out with him on your days off," she pointed out logically. "Well, that was to accompany you today," I explained gently. As we chatted, we reached the room number Robert had given me. I was surprised to find it was a VIP room. Two sharply dressed men stood guard outside the door, looking like professional bodyguards. Feeling slightly intimidated, I walked up carefully. One of the bodyguards greeted us. "Hello, you must be Miss Emily Miller? Mr. Carter mentioned you would be coming." Mr. Carter? I was confused by the formal address, but the bodyguard opened the door for us. I walked in, feeling a little dazed. The VIP room was spacious and luxuriously appointed. On the bed lay a very elegant, middle-aged woman. That must be Robert's mother, Helen Carter. As I tried to figure out the appropriate way to address her, I suddenly realized she looked incredibly familiar. Wasn't she the legendary businesswoman Helen Carter, the founder of the Carter Group? After divorcing her husband due to his infidelity, she had single-handedly built her company while raising her son. Now the Carter Group ranked among the top 10 corporations nationwide. So Robert was essentially the heir to the Carter Group empire. Why, then, had he started his own separate venture, Bright Star? There were a few other people in the room, likely her personal assistants. I handed the flowers and fruit I had brought to one of them. Helen Carter smiled warmly and greeted me. "You must be Emily. Thank you for coming and for the trouble. Please, come have a seat." She asked someone to bring over 2 chairs for Sophie and me. Sophie immediately went to her side. "President Carter," Helen Carter smiled, much like Robert did. "No need to be so formal. You can just call me Helen." Not wanting to argue with the patient, I agreed, saying, "All right, Miss Helen." Helen Carter looked delighted. "Thank you for taking care of Sophie today, Emily." I quickly waved my hands. Oh no, it was no trouble at all. It felt more like a treat for me, getting to enjoy the amusement park and a nice lunch. Sophie seemed tense. "Mom, how are you feeling?" Helen Carter gently patted Sophie's head. "I'm fine, dear." She then took my hand briefly. "I'm sorry we're meeting like this, with me in the hospital. I couldn't prepare a proper meeting gift for you. I hope you don't mind." "Oh no, Ms. Helen, you really don't have to worry about that," I stammered. She interrupted with a bright smile. "No, I insist. Once everything settles down, I'll treat you to a proper meal. You know, Emily, we have a bit of a connection, you and I." "A connection?" I was too startled to respond properly. "Auntie, Miss Helen, I'm just your son's employee. You really don't need to treat me like this. And what kind of connection do we have?" After chatting for a little while longer, I noticed Helen Carter looked somewhat weary. I quickly suggested, "Ms. Helen, perhaps you need to rest for a bit." Helen Carter noticed my concern and smiled. "I'm really all right, just a little tired. And I had some things happen earlier today." As she said the last part, her smile faded slightly. Just then, a phone rang within the room. An assistant brought the phone over. "President, it's Mr. Robert calling." Ms. Helen took the call, spoke briefly, hung up, and then smiled at me. "Robert will be here soon. He'll take you both back." After sitting for a few more minutes, I could see Ms. Helen was genuinely exhausted. Figuring Robert would arrive shortly, I took Sophie's hand and said our goodbyes. The moment Sophie and I stepped out of building 2, I heard a familiar and intensely annoying voice. Auntie, there she is. Mark got hurt today and Clara felt terrible about it, but Emily just left with some random guy. I looked up and saw my mother, Susan, standing there, her face contorted with anger, glaring at me as if she wanted to tear me apart. Ms. Miller stormed towards me and raised her hand to strike me again. This time, I immediately caught her wrist. Emily, you've got some nerve. I'm your mother. Am I not allowed to hit my own daughter? The law doesn't say parents are allowed to hit their adult children, I retorted calmly. Have you no conscience? She shrieked. Your sister is still lying in a hospital bed. Mark has always been so good to our family, and here you are running off with some random man. Sophie, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up indignantly. My brother Robert isn't some random guy, and he's way better than whoever you're supporting. Ms. Miller shot Sophie a disdainful glance. Are you that desperate for a man, Emily, already wanting to help take care of other people's children? Even though I knew Ms. Miller's character well, her words made anger flash through me. A wave of dizziness washed over me as my temper rose. Sophie rushed forward protectively. You're mean. You can't talk to Sister Emily like that. Leo suddenly appeared, mimicking Ms. Miller's scornful tone. You're the bad one. Your brother's a random guy and you're just a bastard child. A loud smacking sound echoed through the air. A red handprint appeared on Leo's cheek. Ms. Miller and Leo stood there, stunned. I spoke coldly, my voice low but firm. Remember this. Watch your mouth from now on. Leo, clutching his stinging cheek, started crying in disbelief. You hit me! I'm telling my dad! Dad, hit her! Ms. Miller lunged at me again, shouting, How dare you! But someone caught her arm from behind me. I turned around. It was one of Helen Carter's bodyguards. The president asked me to escort Miss Miller safely, the bodyguard stated calmly, his grip far stronger than mine. Ms. Miller struggled, but she couldn't break free. Leo was also clearly intimidated by the large, imposing bodyguard, his legs visibly shaking. Unable to physically attack me, Ms. Miller began to scream insults. You ungrateful girl, siding with outsiders against your own family. Ungrateful wretch. I chuckled softly, a humorless sound. Sometimes I wish you had never given birth to me. You! Both Miss Miller and Leo were furious, but didn't dare make another move towards me with the bodyguard present. I ignored them and turned to leave again. Emily, stop! My father's voice called out. He must have finished talking with the doctor. It's your duty to support your family. Clara is in the hospital. Go take care of her. I almost laughed. His wife wanted me gone, and here he was insisting I stay and help. No, I'm busy. You have to, Ms. Miller shrieked, still held by the bodyguard. Or I'll go to your office and tell everyone what kind of person you really are. I swung around, glaring at her. She must have thought she finally had some leverage over me. There was a triumphant glint in her eyes. I silently reminded myself that hitting people was illegal and took 2 deep breaths. Go ahead, I wanted to say, but a man's voice spoke the words aloud before I could. I trust my assistant manager wouldn't be swayed by baseless accusations. And if Director Miller truly intends to cause a disturbance at my company, I won't hesitate to involve the police. Robert had arrived. Ms. Miller was taken aback, stammering, Vice President Carter? So, Emily works at the Carter Group? I was surprised too. Robert's startup wasn't called the Carter Group, but hearing her address him as vice president, it seemed he held a position there as well. No wonder he wasn't always present at the Bright Star office. It also looked like Ms. Miller's company had some sort of business partnership with the Carter Group, and they were likely the party in greater need within that relationship. Emily works for the company I founded, Bright Star, Robert clarified calmly, but that doesn't cloud my judgment regarding employee conduct or external disruptions. Ms. Miller's face flushed with embarrassment, but she still tried to maintain a facade of composure. This was just a family squabble, Vice President Carter. You must have misunderstood. She and Clara were truly cut from the same cloth, always hiding behind the shield of family matters. So, threatening to cause chaos at my employee's workplace is just a family squabble? Robert's expression remained hard. With behavior like this, Director Miller, I will have to seriously reconsider your company's partnership with the Carter Group. Ms. Miller, despite her years of experience as a senior executive, struggled to remain composed. I I was just upset. I said some things I didn't mean. What parent would truly harm their own child? It wouldn't be appropriate to involve the Carter Group in our personal affairs, would it? Would President Carter agree with involving the company? Robert's response was frosty. Not everyone is fit to be a parent. Furthermore, my mother has granted me full authority regarding this particular partnership. I would suggest your company find someone more suitable to handle future dealings with us. Ms. Miller's face went pale, but she persisted. My apologies, Vice President Carter. I was careless with my words. We usually have a very good relationship with Emily. I was just overly emotional about her sister's condition this time. As she spoke, she kept darting pleading looks in my direction, silently begging me to back her up. Lies! You just said Sister Emily was desperate for a man. Sophie retorted loudly from beside me. Brother, don't work with her. She called you a random guy. Then Sophie pointed accusingly at Leo. And he called me a bastard. Leo started to lose his temper again. You are a... Ms. Miller panicked and quickly covered Leo's mouth. Vice President Carter, children say things they don't mean. Please just ignore him. Robert let out a cold, short laugh and turned to me and Sophie. I'll take you both home now. Ms. Miller didn't dare try to stop us this time. She could only watch, helpless and furious, as we walked away. Even from a distance, I could still hear Leo shouting behind us, Auntie, why didn't you stop them? Sitting in Robert's car on the way back, I sensed his mood was still somewhat dark. After thinking for a bit, the only explanation I could come up with was that Leo's rude comments, particularly calling Sophie a bastard, i.e., must have deeply angered him. In the back seat, Sophie yawned, clearly tired from the day's events. Robert asked if we could drop her off at home first so she could rest. You should take Sophie straight home, I quickly suggested. I can easily get back to my place on my own from here. No, I need to talk to you about something, he replied, his tone serious. I looked at him puzzled. You need to be careful regarding your sister, he said gravely. Her heart condition might be getting significantly worse. He didn't elaborate further, but his words immediately made me remember the circumstances surrounding my death in the previous life. Back then, after being forced to accept Mark and Clara's relationship, I had tried to distance myself from them completely. But when Clara expressed her wish for my blessing on their union, my parents pressured me relentlessly to help organize their engagement party. Unable to endure the emotional toll any longer, I finally snapped and had a major argument with my parents, running out of the house afterward. Clara chased after me, demanding that I apologize to our parents. During the ensuing scuffle on the sidewalk, she pushed me into the street just as a car was approaching. I was hit. As I lay dying, Clara had a severe heart attack and collapsed nearby. The last thing I overheard was my parents discussing the possibility of transplanting my heart into her. I hadn't wanted to dwell on these painful memories in this new life. My goal was simply to stay far away from all those toxic people. But hearing Robert's warning now made me instantly alert. Was the car accident in my past life truly just an accident? Robert then mentioned that he would be shifting his focus primarily to the Carter Group affairs for the time being, leaving the day-to-day management of Bright Star largely in my hands. I had barely settled into my role as assistant manager under Robert, and now he wanted me to essentially run his startup company? I looked at his serious expression, filled with doubt and questions. What exactly was going on? Back at my desk, I stared blankly at my computer screen, my mind preoccupied with what Robert had told me during the drive back. It turned out that his biological father, Enzo Carter, the man who had abandoned him and his mother years ago, was facing bankruptcy. Together with Robert's uncle, Helen's brother Gene, they were plotting to seize control of the Carter Group, the company Helen had painstakingly built. He came to see me at the company, Robert recounted, his voice tight with suppressed anger. He told me not to blame him, saying he needed to secure some assets for his son from his second marriage. He argued that since I already had my own successful business, Bright Star, the The Carter Group should be handed over to them to manage, claiming they could help it reach its full potential. He implied I wouldn't have time for it anyway, especially with Mom's recent health issues. I couldn't quite decipher the complex mix of emotions on Robert's face as he spoke, but I saw his hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Recalling my father's absurd reasoning still makes me angry. How can a father be so blatantly biased? Biased. I thought I understood Robert's attitude towards me a little better now. I refreshed the newsfeed on my computer and saw a trending topic. Famous pianist Mark Davis suffers shattered right hand. Clicking on the link, I found a video compilation of the incident at the mall earlier that day. News certainly traveled fast in the internet age. With Mark being a public figure, the day's events had quickly gained widespread attention. Around 8 p.m., a reputable news account posted an update, stating they had contacted Mark's management studio. The studio would only confirm that Mark had been injured and was receiving treatment. They claimed they needed to consult with his family to ascertain the extent of the injury and whether it would affect his ability to play, offering no further comment at that time. An hour later, Mark's studio released an official statement announcing that due to unforeseen circumstances, the entire upcoming concert tour had been canceled. Everyone understood this implicitly meant Mark would likely never play the piano professionally again. A few devoted fans tried to comfort themselves online, clinging to the hope that the injury might have been to his waist or leg, not his crucial hands. My parents, Susan and David, didn't stop trying to contact me, and people in the family group chat continued to accuse me of being ungrateful and cold-hearted. Mark's father, Mr. Davis, was particularly nasty in his messages, even making veiled threats. The rest of the Davis family also chimed in, though their criticism was less harsh, mainly focusing on my supposed coldness and inability to let go of grudges. Luckily, I had muted notifications for most of these contacts and only checked the messages occasionally for a grim sort of amusement. Compared to dealing with those people, focusing on work felt much more productive and important. To help me quickly adapt to my new responsibilities at Brightstar, Robert brought in his college friend Ben. Ben had recently left his previous job and readily accepted Robert's invitation to come assist me. The next day, after Robert briefed us on our immediate tasks in the meeting room, Ben shook my hand with a wide smile. "Looking forward to working with you, Chief Emily." I nearly choked on my tea. "You're too kind. Please just call me Emily." Robert coughed lightly. "You can address her as Ms. Miller, or assistant manager for now, Ben. And your title is assistant, remember?" Ben exclaimed dramatically, "We were best friends in college, Robert, and now I'm just assistant Ben?" He turned to me with a teasing grin. "Were you perhaps drawn to this startup primarily because of Robert's good looks?" I started coughing, feeling extremely awkward. Robert adopted a serious expression. "Assistant Manager Miller is quite capable, Ben. Don't scare her away on your first day." I quickly clarified, "Not at all. I just thought working at a startup might involve less office politics." Ben glanced between Robert and me, a knowing smile playing on his lips. When Ben heard that Helen Carter was in the hospital, he offered to visit her as well. So the three of us headed there together after work that day. In the VIP ward, we found Helen looking much better. She smiled and reassured us that the doctor expected her to be discharged within a couple of days. After chatting for a while, Helen wanted to discuss some Carter Group business privately with Robert. Since neither Ben nor I worked directly for the Carter Group, we politely excused ourselves. Outside the ward, waiting near the elevators, I spotted my parents not too far away. They looked exhausted and deeply worried. When they saw me, perhaps because Robert wasn't present this time, my mother Susan's attitude stiffened immediately. "Your sister is still seriously ill in the hospital and you're just ignoring her. Do you have any conscience left at all?" My father, David, sighed deeply, unable to hide his fatigue. "The doctor said Clara's heart condition might be worsening, Emily. We're tired. Can't you just be considerate for once?" I was shocked. So Robert's warning was true. In my previous life, after the incident where Clara feigned weakness in front of Mark to delay my rescue, she had stayed in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. But the doctors couldn't find any significant issues with her heart function at that time. Thinking quickly, I turned to Ben and said, "Mr. Ben, could you perhaps wait for me at the coffee shop downstairs? I need to handle something quickly." Ben glanced at my parents, nodded understandingly, said, "Okay, take your time," and left. Once Ben was gone, I pulled out my phone, discreetly started recording again, and said with forced calm, bordering on sarcasm, "You should be more concerned about your daughter's health right now. I don't understand why you keep coming to me, essentially a stranger at this point." Susan looked like she was about to explode, but David held her back. "Emily, we both have jobs," David said, his voice strained, possibly through gritted teeth. "We were hoping you could take some time off to take care of Clara." "You should just hire a professional nurse," I replied flatly. "I have work responsibilities too." Susan snapped, "A nurse costs money. Why don't you just quit your job?" David chimed in, trying a different tactic. "Look, Emily, I promise we'll help you find an easier, less demanding job once your sister recovers. That way, you won't be so stressed." His comment instantly reminded me of how, right after I graduated, a promising opportunity at a company David knew, initially intended for me, was given to Clara instead because she needed a job change at that moment. "I have mortgage payments to make," I stated firmly. "An easy job likely won't cover my expenses." "Then sell your house," Susan retorted. "I told you not to buy it in the first place. You have a room here." David stopped Susan's rant again and added, his voice dropping lower, "There's another thing, Emily. The doctor mentioned that follow-up treatments for Clara might cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're currently short on cash, so could you perhaps—" I cut him off sharply. "Ask Mark for the money, and by the way, Susan, you're mistaken. There's no room for me at your house. Those two rooms are Clara's bedroom and her study now. I have no intention of moving back into a storage room." David's face tightened. "Mark is in no position to help right now. Can't we work something out about the rooms? Just help us get through this difficult time, will you?" I chuckled humorlessly. "Need a reminder? You have substantial liquid assets, probably close to $1 million if you count everything. As long as you're not trying to buy property right now, you can definitely handle the compensation for your friend's car accident and Clara's medical treatments. If things get really tight, sell some of those company shares or that extra property you own." "Those are meant for Clara. We can't sell them." David raised his voice, his composure finally breaking. "Clara is seriously ill. Don't you care about your own sister at all?" I just sneered softly. "What exactly do you want from me? For me to offer her my heart? I'm not dead yet." Both of them erupted simultaneously. "You." I pulled the official household registration document, the one I had taken from their study earlier, out of my bag and handed it to them. Since hearing about Clara's worsening condition from Robert, I had anticipated running into my parents at the hospital today and had come prepared. They looked stunned. "How did you get this?" Susan snatched it from my hand and quickly flipped to the page with my information. Her face contorted with fury. "I should never have had you." Gazing at their shocked and angry reactions, I finally voiced the question that had lingered in my mind for 2 lifetimes. "Why did you have me in the first place?" They clearly adored Clara. Shouldn't they have focused all their love and resources on her? Why have another child, only to treat her with such distance, providing only the basic necessities for survival and education? When I got injured as a child, their primary reaction was usually anger and scolding, not concern. In my past life, a tiny part of me had clung to the hope that maybe they did care for me, just not as much as they cared for Clara. Looking back now, was their plan from the beginning to have a second child? Or did the idea of using me for Clara's potential benefit only arise later? David erupted in anger. "At a time like this, you're picking fights over the past? When will you ever grow up, Emily?" Susan seemed to be losing control, screaming hysterically. "Why did we have you? You were meant for Clara. Everything about you is for, Susan!" David barked sharply. Susan snapped back to her senses, cutting her sentence short abruptly. I sighed, a deep sense of weary confirmation washing over me. Of course, that was the reason. Maybe they didn't explicitly plan for me to be an organ donor from birth, but the underlying sentiment was clear. In a critical moment, I would be considered expendable for Clara's sake. "That's not happening," I said softly but firmly. "Don't even think about it." "Emily, you've misunderstood," David protested weakly. "I have things to do," I stated, turning away. "I would appreciate it if you didn't bother me again." Susan was shaking with rage. Fine. If that's how you want it, we're cutting ties. We don't recognize you as our daughter anymore. Please do, I murmured, stopping the recording on my phone. That sounds perfectly acceptable to me. Following the directions Ben had sent via message, I went to the coffee shop he mentioned. As soon as I stepped inside, I saw him engaged in what looked like an argument with a young woman. Actually, it was mostly her angrily confronting him while he remained relatively calm. Finally, Ben said coolly, I can't help you with this. You need to leave. The woman stormed off, visibly frustrated. After she left, Ben spotted me and waved me over. As I approached, I fumbled for words and blurted out, ex-girlfriend? I instantly regretted asking, realizing I was prying into his or someone else's private affairs. Ben laughed. Yeah, although not mine. It involved someone else. Definitely not my business then. Ben, however, chuckled again. The person in question just arrived, actually. If you're curious, you can ask him yourself. Turning around, I saw Robert walking towards our table. He shot Ben a disapproving look. Ben just shrugged innocently. I messaged you saying she was here. He defended himself. So, the woman was Robert's ex-girlfriend, Olivia. Trying to steer the conversation away from awkward territory, I changed the subject. Boss, are you finished talking with President Carter? Robert sat down. Yes, let's just eat here. Ben quickly stood up. Actually, I just remembered I have some stuff to do. You two enjoy your meal. See you Monday. Before either of us could react, he practically darted out of the coffee shop. So, it was just Robert and me again. But somehow, it didn't feel as awkward as before. Ben's comment about the woman being Robert's ex, combined with her earlier confrontation, piqued my curiosity about their past. Curious? I noticed Robert watching me with a slight smile. It seemed my curiosity was obvious. I shook my head quickly. No, not at all. Robert took a sip of his drink. There isn't much to tell, really. She didn't understand my decision to leave the Carter Group and start my own venture from scratch. She thought it was too risky, so she ended up getting involved with my half-brother. He continued calmly. What she didn't know at the time was that Bright Star was actually planned in coordination with my mother. The intention was always for it to eventually merge back into the Carter Group structure. I see, I murmured. And lately, my biological father's company is facing bankruptcy, and his son, well, isn't doing much better either. So she's trying to patch things up with you now, I inferred. Everyone has their own goals and makes choices accordingly, Robert said evenly. I don't necessarily blame her for the choices she made back then. But people change, situations change, and trying to go back to the way things were, that's just not possible. So, did she want Mr. Ben to act as a mediator between you two? I asked. Robert nodded. She came by the Carter Group headquarters before, and she might try coming to the Bright Star office next. You and Ben might have to deal with her then. I understood. Robert wasn't just gossiping about his ex. He was giving me a heads up, essentially assigning me a task that went beyond typical work duties. I sighed inwardly, feeling a strange sense of shared burden. What's wrong? Robert asked. Nothing much, I replied. Just thinking that our situations seem kind of similar in some ways. Then, I quickly snapped back to reality, feeling flustered. I felt so awkward. Why on earth was I discussing personal similarities with my boss? But then, an idea struck me. I looked him directly in the eye and asked softly, Is that the real reason why you're so keen on being friends with me? Robert nodded slightly, a kind smile touching his lips. After hearing your story and observing your situation, it reminded me of my mother, of Sophie, and of myself. He mentioned Helen Carter, and suddenly I remembered her words in the hospital room about us having a connection. But how? I voiced my confusion aloud. He laughed lightly. At first, I noticed you simply because I happened to witness that argument you had with your family outside the garden complex. It just caught my attention then. Then you realized I'm also someone who didn't exactly receive unconditional love from my parents? I ventured. I never thought an experience like that could inadvertently lead to such a potentially valuable connection. Seeing things in a new light, I grinned and said, Boss, you mentioned before that I could call you by your first name outside of work hours. Is that offer still valid? Robert chuckled. Of course it's valid, Emily. I laughed too. Okay then. This next period looks like it's going to be challenging. So remember to give me that raise and promotion you mentioned, Robert. Over the following 2 weeks, my parents didn't bother me directly. They were probably overwhelmed dealing with the financial claims from the car accident caused by my father's friend and managing Clara's ongoing medical treatments. There were still occasional rumors and discussions online about Mark's hand injury, but the buzz was gradually fading. Helen Carter was recovering well. The day Robert picked Helen up from the hospital, he called me into his office at Brightstar. I assumed it was about company business, but surprisingly, it turned out to be about Clara. Apparently, Clara's condition was indeed quite serious. After a round of consultations with various specialists, the local doctors weren't very optimistic about her prognosis. One doctor mentioned that a renowned foreign heart specialist, a Professor Davies, might potentially offer some hope, but he lived abroad and was notoriously difficult to contact. Even with my parents' social connections, securing a consultation with such a high-profile expert seemed like a long shot. However, Helen Carter happened to be an old acquaintance of this specialist. My parents, desperate, saw Robert picking up Helen from the hospital and approached him, asking for his help in contacting Professor Davies. I was stunned. How did they even find out about Helen's connection to him? Robert smiled faintly. The professor gave an interview some time ago where he mentioned some of his past collaborations and friendships, including one with my mother. They probably found out by doing some intensive research online. I felt embarrassed. I'm sorry, Robert, for them bothering you and Ms. Helen about this. It's no problem, he said kindly. But I wanted to ask your opinion about it first, Emily. If you want me to help them, I can try reaching out to the professor. I knew Robert was likely thinking I might feel conflicted or soft-hearted, given the gravity of the situation. He saw me hesitate and added gently, Don't feel like you'd be burdening me or owing me a favor if you decide you want me to try. I shook my head firmly. I consider you a friend now, Robert. If I truly needed your help for something important to me, I wouldn't hesitate to ask. I added with a small smile, I just don't want to owe a friend a favor for their sake. Robert smiled back, seeming relieved. Good. I'm glad you have a clear perspective on it. But they will probably try reaching out to you again about this. Yeah, I grinned wryly. I figured as much. Sure enough, within 3 days, they contacted me again. I had recently started acting as the general manager of Brightstar and was extremely busy dealing with various company tasks. I barely had time to check my personal phone. When I finally did, I found it flooded with messages. A barrage of accusations, criticisms, and desperate pleas. Emily, I'm begging you, please ask your boss. You wouldn't just stand by and watch as your family faces this crisis, would you? From Dad. Let's not dwell on you hitting Leo or who was right or wrong in the past. We can deal with that later. The urgent matter right now is your sister's condition. You don't want your parents to have to bury their own child, do you? From Uncle George. What are you telling her? She's so stubborn. Emily, if anything happens to Clara, your father and I will donate everything we own to charity. Don't think you'll inherit a single penny from Mom. Emily, I've watched you grow up. I practically consider you family. Just listen to me this once, okay? I don't blame you for what happened to Mark's hand. It's already done. But at least your sister still has a chance. Please help. From Mrs. Davis. I was surprised that the Davises were still so invested in helping Clara, despite Mark's career-ending injury. Was it because Mark's hand was confirmed to be beyond saving? From online rumors, it seemed they were considering suing the store clerk involved in the mall incident. I looked up Professor Davies online and learned that the hospital where he worked was also renowned for its orthopedics department. It made sense now. They were likely still clinging to the hope of finding a miracle cure for their son's hand. And getting access to that hospital through the heart specialist connection was their strategy. Parental love in its own complicated way. Mrs. Davis's message trying to leverage our past acquaintance made me laugh internally. I finally replied to her. Mrs. Davis, what past kindness are you referring to exactly? The group chat immediately exploded again with a mix of scolding and persuasive messages. Emily, by calling me Mrs. Davis, are you intentionally ignoring our past connection? Don't you remember all the gifts I brought for both you and Clara, the times I took you both out? From Mrs. Davis. I replied, I only remember you taking Clara out and bringing her gifts. I'm not holding any grudges. You have the right to take whoever you want out and give gifts to whomever you wish. But please don't act like you did me any significant favors. I then went on to reply to the others in the group chat. Professor Davies isn't retired. Asking him to come all the way from abroad would require significant favors and substantial financial commitment. I can't just approach my boss with an empty-handed request for something like this. How much would it cost? Would $1 million be enough? From Dad. Stop shouting about money. Honestly, I cannot help with this. After sending this final message, I was surprised that my parents, David and Susan, suddenly stopped pestering me. My friend sent me a direct message online. Mark wants to see you, he said. At least this time it wasn't your leg that got hurt. I frowned. Had Mark somehow been reborn too? Or did he just possess some kind of omniscient perspective now? To find out, I agreed to visit him at the hospital where he was still recovering. When I saw Mark again, he was lying in bed. The bruises and minor fractures from the escalator fall had healed, but his right hand, the crucial one for his career, was still heavily bandaged. He looked haggard and worn, a shadow of the vibrant young pianist he once was. He didn't bother with small talk and got straight to the point. I had a dream, he began. As soon as he spoke those words, I knew. He somehow had access to the events of my past life, perhaps through a dream or vision. What he described matched my previous existence perfectly. He finally concluded, after I woke up from that dream, your recent attitude started to make sense. You knew something dangerous was going to happen at the mall that day, didn't you? I shrugged nonchalantly. So what if I did? Do you feel better now, seeing me like this? Mark asked, laughing feebly, a self-deprecating sound. If my dream was real, then I owe you an apology for what happened in that past life. But Clara is still your sister, Emily, and she didn't mean for things to happen the way they did back then either. His voice turned pleading. Your parents didn't intentionally let you die. They just felt hopeless at that moment, and Clara's condition was critical. She couldn't wait. So please, Emily, you have to save Clara. It turned out the only reason he wanted to see me was to plead for his love, Clara. I felt surprisingly calm, almost admiring his unwavering devotion to her even now. If it were anyone else asking, under different circumstances, I might have considered it. Are you finished? I asked coolly. I'm leaving. Emily, are you really this heartless? Mark cried out. Mark, I replied evenly. Do you have any idea how much effort and social capital it would take to pull the strings necessary to get that specialist involved? If it were simply a matter of making a phone call, I might consider doing it just to stop Clara's parents from bothering me constantly, but it's not that simple. And frankly, I'm not willing to expend another ounce of energy on any of you. Don't blame me then, Emily, Mark muttered as I opened the door. Ignoring his last cryptic words, I walked out. As I exited the room, I brushed past a figure wearing a hat pulled down low, obscuring their face. Something about their build and posture felt vaguely familiar. It looked like a woman. Clara was still confined to her hospital bed, so it couldn't be her. Had Mark found another woman already, and why did she seem familiar? I shook my head, dismissing the fleeting thought as unimportant. A little further down the corridor, I saw my parents and the Davises gathered near the third-floor service desk, likely discussing Clara and Mark's situations. I walked past them without acknowledgement, heading towards the elevator. My mother's cold voice followed me. Emily, this is your last chance. Will you go to Mr. Carter or not? It's not like you're being asked to donate your heart. I hit the elevator button, ignoring her. Don't say later that I didn't give you a chance out of mother-daughter love. The same line Mark had used. So predictable, so annoying. At the hospital exit, I saw Robert's familiar Bentley waiting. Get in, Robert said, his expression unusually serious as I approached. He seemed upset. Why was he here? Before coming to the hospital to see Mark, I had told Ben, my assistant, to call the police if he didn't hear back from me within a certain time frame, just as a precaution. I got into the car, feeling confused. Thankfully, Robert didn't keep me guessing for long. You told Ben to take precautions, but you didn't tell me? He asked, his voice tinged with a hint of helplessness or perhaps frustration. I felt a bit helpless too. Weren't Ben and I supposed to be working overtime together today? You were busy dealing with the Carter Group matters. I didn't want to bother you with my personal issues. Should I transfer Ben over to the Carter Group and stay here at Bright Star myself then? Robert asked, looking at me intently. I was momentarily dumbfounded, unsure how to interpret his question. We drove in silence for a while. When we arrived back at the Bright Star office building just as I was about to get out, Robert said, I've got some time now. Let's go inside together. So I waited until he parked the car and we walked through the main entrance of Bright Star together. Right as we entered the lobby, we heard a commotion near the reception desk. Ben, we were college friends. I can't believe you're being like this. Robert is single, isn't he? He must be waiting for me. It sounded like a woman arguing heatedly with Ben. As we got closer, I recognized her. It was Olivia, Robert's ex-girlfriend from the coffee shop encounter. I glanced at Robert, noticing his deepening frown. Olivia, can't you see it? Ben was saying patiently but firmly. I'm only being honest with you because we used to be friends. You don't stand a chance with Robert anymore. Olivia and Ben both noticed us approaching as Ben finished speaking. Thankfully, it was after regular work hours, so there weren't many people around, just one confused receptionist watching the unfolding drama. Olivia's eyes welled up with tears when she saw Robert. I tried to quietly step aside, not wanting to intrude on their personal matter, but Robert unexpectedly pulled me closer to his side. I was about to protest when he subtly mouthed the words, "Help me." Then, addressing Olivia directly, he said clearly, "Let me introduce you. This is my girlfriend, Emily Miller." Don't drag me into your personal drama, I wanted to shout, but I remained silent. Ben just narrowed his eyes, a smirk playing on his lips. I was speechless. Olivia looked tearful and accusatory. You're still mad at me, aren't you? You're just using her to get back at me. Robert coolly replied, You know I don't play games like that, Olivia. Yeah, right. Aren't you playing one right now? Olivia retorted before running out of the lobby crying. I immediately pulled my arm away from Robert's grasp, not happy about being used as a prop. Robert turned to me, his expression apologetic. I'm sincerely sorry about that, Emily. Once all this settles down, I promise I'll see to it that you get that promotion and raise. Wow, more talk of money. But that wasn't really the point. Robert left after lingering for a few more minutes. I made an excuse about needing to finish some work to avoid having to see him off. When Ben returned to the main office area after Olivia's departure, I wasn't thrilled with him either. Ben, I told you to come if I needed help. Why did Robert show up instead? He just shrugged nonchalantly. Just helping out a brother, you know? I was speechless again. What on earth was he talking about? Ben smiled mischievously. Besides, I think you're a much better match for him than Olivia ever was, Emily. I ended up chasing him out of my temporary office area with a folder, telling him to get back to work. I had a feeling things weren't quite settled between Robert and me, but since neither of us had explicitly addressed the girlfriend declaration or his earlier question about him staying at Bright Star, I didn't want to bring it up without a clear reason. It would be incredibly embarrassing if I misinterpreted the situation. Before I could figure out how to navigate this new awkwardness, Robert's disgruntled relatives started stirring up trouble again. They began spreading rumors online, alleging that both the Carter Group and Bright Star were involved in illegal business practices, that Helen Carter had cheated on her husband years ago, twisting the narrative of Enzo's infidelity, and that Robert was neglecting his family obligations by ignoring his father's supposed bankruptcy. I knew their goal was to undermine Helen and Robert's authority and reputation within the Carter Group and the broader business community. The negative attention on the Carter Group hadn't completely faded yet, so they also targeted Bright Star, using similar tactics, probably hoping to destabilize Robert's position further. To keep Robert from worrying unnecessarily while he dealt with the Carter Group issues, Ben and I worked tirelessly to manage the public relations crisis at Bright Star, stabilizing the situation and refuting the false claims. We barely had time to catch our breath. But just as things seemed to calm down, they launched a new wave of attacks. Robert's half-brother, Robin Carter, posted a long, rambling message online. He accused Robert of abandoning his previous girlfriend, Olivia, for a new one, me. He claimed Olivia had only turned to him, Robin, for comfort after being dumped by Robert. He further alleged that Robert had essentially gifted Bright Star to me, allowing me, an inexperienced newcomer, to run it into the ground, which was demonstrably false. Robin also fabricated a story claiming it was only because his father, Enzo, had generously split his assets with his ex-wife, Helen, during their divorce, that she was able to succeed in her business ventures. I found these ridiculous statements almost laughable, especially considering Robin's online account name, which translated to something like man of principle. What a comical misnomer. It seemed Enzo's side of the family hadn't coordinated their stories properly with Helen's disgruntled brother, Gene. Soon after Robin's post went viral, the Carter Group faction led by Gene released a contradictory message. Gene publicly claimed that his sister, Helen, had received practically nothing in the divorce settlement and had relied entirely on him for the funding to start her company. He alleged that now that the Carter Group was flourishing, his nephew Robert was trying to kick him out of the company, and he couldn't accept such injustice. Robin and Gene's conflicting narratives made some sensible internet users pause and realize they should probably wait for more concrete facts before jumping to conclusions. I called Robert to check in, and he assured me he was prepared to fight back decisively against both factions. Enzo's side, however, still seemed to think their smear tactics were effective. Olivia probably believed their narrative too. Despite Robert clearly rejecting her recently, she showed up at the Bright Star office again within days. I encountered her at the front desk where security had stopped her. She looked at me with thinly veiled scorn and said haughtily, "Robert's taste in women seems to be getting worse over time. I'll give you $1 million if you leave him." I nodded calmly. "Sure, transfer the money now." Olivia was stunned, clearly not expecting me to agree so readily or call her bluff so directly. She stammered, "Well, once you actually leave him—" I cut her off, my voice cool. "Oh, so you don't actually have $1 million readily available? You really thought you could play me with an empty promise? My annual salary is almost that much anyway." Truthfully, I was bluffing slightly about the salary. Robert hadn't officially confirmed the details of my raise and new compensation package yet. Oh, right, I reminded myself. I really needed to ask him about that. Olivia stormed off in a huff, furious and embarrassed. A few days later, Robert launched his counteroffensive. He first released concrete proof that both the Carter Group and Bright Star were operating legally and ethically. Then, Helen Carter disclosed evidence of Enzo's multiple affairs during their marriage and the actual details of their divorce agreement. The agreement clearly stated that she'd only agreed to an uneven split of assets, receiving less than she was entitled to, primarily to expedite the divorce process and start a new life with Robert, as Enzo had been deliberately dragging out the proceedings. Back then, the older generation of the Carter family showed strong favoritism towards males, with most of the family assets controlled by or designated for her brother Gene. Helen had received only a relatively small amount of cash in the settlement. There was absolutely no financial support from her brother for starting her company. She had built it through her own efforts and other investments. Once the legitimacy of the Carter Group and Bright Star was firmly established, damaging information about Enzo and his son Robin began to surface online, likely leaked strategically. Following his remarriage, Enzo's philandering had continued, although his current wife was apparently more formidable and managed to prevent any more illegitimate children from appearing. His company was reportedly filled with his current wife's relatives, whose mismanagement had driven it to the brink of bankruptcy. Robin himself was portrayed as irresponsible and unprofessional, known for harassing female colleagues. Despite having a girlfriend, he frequented online forums where he maliciously misinterpreted women's usernames and wrote inappropriate, fictional stories about other users. Internet sleuths, spurred on by the unfolding drama, dug deeper and uncovered evidence confirming that Olivia had indeed left Robert years ago for someone she perceived as having better financial prospects, Robin, ironically. They hadn't had any contact for years until her recent attempts to reconcile. I, portrayed by the rumors as the new affair, had only joined Bright Star relatively recently and had no prior connection to Robert. It became clear I wasn't a third party in their past relationship at all. Soon after these revelations, official government agencies released statements announcing investigations into Enzo and Robin Carter for alleged tax fraud and potential links to organized crime. Both were quickly arrested. The third person involved in Enzo's original affair, whose actions contributed to the divorce, was also implicated and faced legal consequences. Robert's uncle, Gene, already burdened with heavy gambling debts, reportedly sold his house and fled with his family to another state to avoid creditors and potential legal troubles stemming from his attempts to seize control of the Carter Group. Olivia gained a certain level of notoriety from the scandal and seemed to settle down afterward, keeping a low profile, but whether she had truly moved on remained uncertain. Everything seemed to have worked out in Robert's favor, yet I still felt a lingering sense of unease. Sure enough, about a month later, I received an unexpected phone call. "Hello, Miss Emily Miller. This is the production team of the television show Family Affairs." I was in a meeting with Robert and Ben at the time. I hadn't expected my family to escalate things by going directly to a national television show, but it was a clever, if desperate, move. Going public yet through a popular TV program combined with the inevitable online discussion would guarantee another wave of widespread attention. They had clearly waited for the intense media frenzy surrounding the Enzo Carter drama to die down before making their move, probably learning from the swift downfall of Robert's relatives. I turned on the large monitor in the meeting room, switching it to the channel broadcasting Family Affairs. Their segment was live. They had gathered everyone, my parents, the Davises, Uncle George, Leo, in Clara's hospital room. On screen, Clara appeared reasonably stable, though still clearly unwell. My parents must have managed to secure some specialist consultations for her through their own connections after realizing the path through Helen Carter was closed. The show's producers likely knew I would refuse to appear on camera, so they opted for this tactic, calling me live from her hospital room, hoping to catch me off guard and pressure me publicly. The host immediately asked blunt questions. "Miss Miller, while your sister lies here on her sickbed, are you really choosing to ignore your family entirely, simply because of perceived parental favoritism in the past? Isn't it somewhat justifiable for parents to show more concern for a child who has been frail and ill since childhood?" The host's questioning was sharp and clearly biased, designed to paint me in a negative light. Discussions online about this televised confrontation began to grow rapidly. The conversation on the show quickly steered towards criticizing my character and actions, especially with my mother, Susan, actively twisting the truth and painting herself and Clara as victims. This only fueled more harsh comments from viewers online. What an ungrateful person. Her family desperately needed money, and all she cared about was buying a house for herself? She wasn't even willing to let her sick sister use one room as a study. She could have used it too, couldn't she? And she broke ties with her entire family over a man? Sure, it's a bit strange that the guy liked the sister after dating her first, but seeing how Emily behaves, I can kind of understand why he left her. Wait, didn't the parents say the guy actually liked the sister first? That Emily was just clinging on to him? See, having kids is really a gamble. You might just end up raising an ungrateful brat like this. I looked at these comments scrolling across a secondary feed and frowned. In my past life, words like these might have deeply wounded me. Now they just felt bothersome. "Need me to help?" Robert asked, a slight smile playing on his lips. Although I felt he probably knew I wouldn't just sit back and do nothing, and that I likely had already made some counterplans. "Yeah, actually, I could use some help," I admitted, sending Robert the compilation of materials I had meticulously organized. It included all the audio recordings and screenshots I had gathered since my rebirth, carefully annotated with context. I had spent quite some time putting together a detailed report. I am practical enough to use every resource available to effectively solve a problem like this. Ben sneered at the antics of my family, and Clara displayed on the screen, eager to assist in setting the record straight. So Robert immediately contacted the Carter Group's public relations department, while Ben started working to trace the source of the most aggressive online trolls attacking me. Miss Miller. After some time had passed with me silently observing the screen and coordinating with Robert and Ben, the person on the other end of the phone line, the show's host, began urging me impatiently. I put the phone back to my ear. "Yes, I'm still here." "Are you reflecting on your actions, Miss Miller?" The host pressed. "Remember the sayings, even animals like sheep and crows show gratitude to those who raise them. If you forget your parents' kindness over trivial matters and refuse to honor them, aren't you behaving worse than an animal? The host's expression became increasingly pointed and judgmental. In the hospital room shown on screen, Clara anxiously reached out and weakly shook her head at the host, seemingly trying to stop the harsh questioning. The host, however, continued, "Look at your sister, Miss Miller. Even in her condition, she wants to speak highly of you." The host instructed the camera operator to zoom in on Clara's face. Clara looked earnest and urgent as she spoke directly to the camera, presumably addressing me. "Emily, I didn't support them doing this show. I know you have issues with us, probably because of Mark, but my own feelings don't matter right now. Mom and Dad both miss you terribly. Please, just apologize to them. As children, we should be willing to endure a little grievance when it comes to our parents, shouldn't we?" The host then turned back to the camera, addressing the audience and me. "Miss Miller, please don't blame me for being blunt. But after witnessing all of this, I truly feel your sister is a much better person than you are. She cares so deeply about you, yet you won't even make simple inquiries about potential help for her condition. This is about her serious illness." My mother, Susan, then jumped in, tears welling in her eyes. "I know Mom neglected you sometimes in the past, Emily, but as long as you come back to us, there will always be a room for you at home." I waited 3 full seconds, ensuring no one else was about to speak, then asked calmly into the phone, "Are you all finished?" Everyone on the screen looked momentarily shocked. The host seemed to adopt a resigned expression as if thinking, "There's no hope for this person." I continued, my voice steady and clear. "Everyone watching, please check the social media platform X later today. There will be video and audio evidence posted." The host quickly asked, "What evidence is that? Why not just provide it to our program directly?" I sneered faintly, letting some of my true feelings show. "Because you are just opportunistic hypocrites, chasing ratings. You didn't bother to investigate the situation properly and just condemned me based on a one-sided story. Therefore, I have no intention of letting you ride the wave of attention this will generate." I ended the call immediately. I looked up to see Robert grinning at me and Ben giving me an enthusiastic thumbs up. We continued watching the television program. Clara was visibly rattled by my mention of evidence on X before I hung up. Her face looked quite pale. The show's producers quickly found an excuse to cut away from the hospital room segment. My parents remained behind, looking stunned and uncertain. However, Uncle George and Leo, who had apparently been lurking nearby, suddenly showed up inside the room just as the broadcast was ending. They hadn't said a word on camera before, but now they trailed my parents as they presumably left the room. The show, hungry for any additional gossip or drama, eagerly extended their microphones towards them again as they emerged into the hospital corridor. Leo, who had been giving me hostile looks earlier when he thought the cameras weren't focused on him, was now playing the role of a polite, well-behaved student. Both he and his father, Uncle George, insisted that my parents and Clara had always treated me well, claiming I was simply petty, selfish, and overly sensitive. They even brought up the incident where I slapped Leo, portraying it as his innocent mistake and my unreasonable intolerance. I thought it was just my immediate family and Uncle George's family who had lost their minds, but I didn't expect Mark and his supposedly sensible parents, the Davises, to chime in as well. Someone online pointed out that Clara bore a resemblance to the woman seen near the scene when Mark was injured at the mall, the one who apparently had a heart attack. Another commenter noted that Clara had mentioned Mark's name during her plea on the show. People began speculating online that Clara and Mark knew each other well, possibly romantically. They connected this to Mark's earlier televised statement about planning to confess to his longtime crush after his tour, guessing that Clara was the crush. Then came the kicker. Mark's official personal social media account liked one of the posts speculating about him and Clara being connected. This sent his remaining fans and the general audience into a frenzy. Shortly after, Mark posted a vague message on his own account, stating that his hand injury might prevent him from ever playing the piano again, but he planned to focus on composing music instead. Since his injury, his management studio had only released a brief, non-committal statement, and he hadn't spoken publicly himself. His sudden personal statement caused another flurry of reposts, comments, and speculation. When asked specifically about me in the comments section, Mark responded indirectly, saying he appreciated my good intentions in the past and hoped I would find someone more suited for me in the future. This phrasing subtly implied that I had been the one clinging to him and that our relationship wasn't serious. The Davis family also quickly jumped in to support their son. They contacted the Family Affairs show directly, stating they wanted to clarify some things which naturally delighted the program's producers. On a subsequent segment, they subtly hinted at my allegedly difficult temper and volatile personality, insisting that I had never truly dated their son in a serious capacity. However, likely concerned about maintaining their own social reputation, they kept their comments somewhat civil, merely advising me to rethink my actions and hurry up in seeking help for Clara. The unsaid implication was clear. It would be ideal if, while seeking help for Clara, I also managed to find a top orthopedic expert at Professor Davies' renowned hospital who could potentially help their son's hand. Seeing all this unfold, I knew the comments directed at me online were probably terrible, but a morbid curiosity still made me want to look. Just as I unlocked my phone and started scrolling through the trending topics, a hand gently covered the screen. "Don't look," Robert said, his voice low. "Give me the remaining evidence you have." How did he know I still had more evidence prepared? So, here's what happened next. I sent Robert all the other evidence I had compiled, including the detailed backstory on why I had slapped Leo that day at the mall, supported by witness accounts I managed to track down from the previous incident, plus all the chat logs from my entire relationship with Mark and other relevant documentation. Normally, I would have deleted old chat logs long ago. It's just my nature to clear out clutter. But before I was reborn, during the time I was completely infatuated with Mark, I had saved everything and never deleted those conversations. Afterward, I simply forgot about them. I hadn't initially planned to release such personal correspondence, but keeping it proved useful as a contingency. The relentless attacks from the other side left me no choice but to defend myself thoroughly. But isn't it incredibly harsh of them to ask for your help for Clara, and then publicly attack you like this? Ben asked, genuinely puzzled by their contradictory behavior. I can sort of understand their twisted logic, I explained tiredly. They probably still believe I'm just throwing an extended tantrum. They figure that if they publicly express their disappointment and disapproval, painting me as the villain, the pressure will force me to go back to being the compliant daughter and sister I used to be, the one who always puts up with everything. Before Robert put his own phone away, I caught a glimpse of a couple of comments on his screen. "If they don't fire that woman Emily, we should boycott Bright Star products." And Robert Carter should fire Emily immediately and use his connections to get an expert for Clara, just to salvage his company's reputation. They really thought they had backed me into a corner, assuming that pride or stubbornness, combined with the threat to my career, would force me to beg Robert for help on their behalf. Yeah, right. In their dreams. After Robert instructed the Carter Group PR team on how to proceed with the next phase of the information release, he joined Ben and me for a late lunch. By the time we got back to the office, the entire online narrative had completely flipped. The Carter Group's PR team collaborated with a well-known online influencer famous for always backing up their claims with solid evidence. They strategically began releasing the information I had provided, starting precisely at 1 p.m., and dropping new pieces of evidence every hour on the hour. When they first released the audio recording detailing the real reasons I had bought the house and why my parents suddenly needed money for the car accident compensation, not just Clara's regular expenses, public opinion began to shift dramatically. People were shocked by my parents' manipulation and demands. Some users even posted public apologies for jumping to conclusions and judging me harshly earlier. However, there were still quite a few people who felt that Clara hadn't directly done anything wrong to me in the recent incidents, and therefore my decision to cut ties was an overreaction. But as more details emerged throughout the afternoon, the history of favoritism, the incident with the study room, the constant expectation for me to sacrifice for Clara, the emotional manipulation regarding the loan, Clara's duplicitous behavior in the cafe, my mother's aggression, and finally, the shocking revelation from my parents' own words about why they might have had me in the first place. Clara's image as a pure, innocent victim started to crumble. Mark's reputation also took a significant hit, as his hypocrisy and dismissive attitude towards our past relationship were exposed through the chat logs. The Davis family, despite holding a respectable position in their social circles, got dragged down as well due to their blind support for their clueless son and their opportunistic attempt to use Clara's situation to potentially benefit Mark's hand injury. Uncle George and Leo, who couldn't resist inserting themselves into the drama, also faced intense public criticism for their entitled attitude and rude behavior. Wow, what kind of parents are these? One comment read. Some people are saying it's their right to give everything to the older daughter, but they still have the nerve to demand the younger one use her savings to clean up their financial mess. And from that audio clip where the mom screamed, it sounds like they literally had the younger daughter just in case the older one needed a heart transplant. Seriously, that's beyond creepy. I hope I misunderstood that. Nope, you didn't misunderstand. That's exactly what she implied. Parents like that don't deserve to have children. And the sister Clara seems like a real piece of work too. Her and Mark are a perfect match. Both manipulative liars, right? Reading their old chat logs, you can see they definitely dated. But now Mark is trying to spin it like Emily was just desperately clinging to him. Disgusting. I used to admire his piano skills, but I'm completely over him now. Honestly, you have to separate talent from personality sometimes. He might still be talented musically and could potentially do well as a composer. That cousin Leo was incredibly annoying too, randomly calling people bastards. I would have slapped him too, for sure. When I got tired of focusing on work, I would scroll through the comments section, and reading the public's reactions actually helped lift my spirits somewhat. Of course, there were still some dissenting voices. Am I the only one who thinks the timing and completeness of these recordings and screenshots seem a little too convenient? Are they even authentic? Even if they are real, Emily seems kind of scary for secretly recording her family and friends like that. Someone quickly countered that comment. With a family full of emotional vampires like that, it's perfectly normal and necessary to protect yourself. Besides, the recordings seemed to be mostly from after New Year's this year, which means she only recently started standing up for herself. Yeah, it all seems legitimate. Otherwise, the people from that TV show would have been screaming denials by now. Speaking of which, I heard Family Affairs has been temporarily suspended, LOL. My awesome boss, Robert, also threw in some subtle shade online. He posted a brief statement on his official account, confirming that I had indeed once inquired generally about medical specialists through him, referring to my initial query after he warned me about Clara's condition, not a plea for help. He stated that although he personally disliked the individuals involved, he had still made discreet inquiries, out of respect for the gravity of a life-or-death situation. He reported that Professor Davies, the renowned specialist, had unfortunately indicated he could not adjust his schedule or travel for at least 6 months due to prior commitments to his current patients. Robert concluded by saying the professor sent his best wishes to Clara from abroad. Professor Davies himself confirmed this account by retweeting Robert's statement with a brief corroborating comment. I felt slightly embarrassed by Robert's portrayal, as I had never actually asked him to intervene for Clara and never would have, but I understood he was strategically positioning me in a more favorable light. Who knows if my parents felt any regret now, seeing their manipulative tactics backfire so spectacularly. Robert had to leave again to deal with ongoing matters at the Carter Group. Before clocking out for the day, my secretary informed me that 2 couples, presumably my parents and the Davises, were downstairs passionately demanding to see me. They were like persistent ghosts that just wouldn't fade away. It was a pity Mark was apparently out of the hospital and resting at home. Otherwise, the Davises probably wouldn't have had the time or inclination to come stir up more trouble here. I instructed the secretary to call building security and have them escorted out, while I gathered my things to head home as usual. However, they weren't giving up easily. When I stepped out of the elevator into the main lobby and waited near the entrance for my pre-booked ride, they spotted me and tried to rush towards me again, forcing me to retreat back inside the secure area of the building. Luckily, the building's security personnel did their job effectively and kept the 4 of them outside the glass doors. My mother, Judy, was yelling her head off, her voice muffled through the glass. "You monster! You're just going to let your sister die. If anything happens to Clara, I will never, ever forgive you. I ignored her histrionics and calmly addressed the Davises, who appeared slightly more restrained but still visibly anxious. Even a miracle worker can't make Mark play the piano professionally again with a shattered hand. Just give it up. A small crowd of onlookers was beginning to gather in the plaza outside. As people started recognizing the four individuals causing the commotion from the recent online drama, they began murmuring and pointing. Unable to handle the negative attention and public scrutiny, the four had no choice but to finally leave, looking sullen and defeated. As they walked away, my father, David, gave me one last complicated, unreadable look. Just then, the car I had booked pulled up surprisingly quickly right in front of the entrance. The driver even waved at me somewhat familiarly through the windshield. How odd. But we hadn't driven off for more than a minute when I received a text message notification on my phone from the ride-sharing app. Miss Miller, your driver has arrived. Where are you? Staring at the unfamiliar driver in the front seat, a chill ran down my spine. I immediately sent a distress message with my current location to the police emergency number saved on my phone. The driver noticed my sudden movement in the rearview mirror and sneered, his voice chillingly different from the usual polite drivers. Too late, he said menacingly,